Defiance is supposed to buy time. In September 1944, a German commander believed that telling George S. Patton, "You'll have to kill me," would slow the Americans down, force negotiation, maybe even earn respect. Instead, that sentence did the opposite. It removed mercy, removed delay, and transformed a fortified stronghold into a scheduled execution that ended in less than 12 hours. If you think defiance always buys time in war, stay with this story, because in this case one sentence did the exact opposite. Defiance has always been romanticized in war. History books, speeches, and movies frame it as courage under pressure, a refusal to bend, a final stand that forces the enemy to reconsider. We are taught almost instinctively that bold words slow violence down. That when a commander draws a line and says, "No further," it introduces doubt, hesitation, even restraint on the other side. This belief is so deeply ingrained that few stop to question it. But that belief only works when the other side still sees negotiation as part of the equation. By late summer of 1944, negotiation was no longer the central currency of the war in Western Europe. The Allied advance after the breakout from Normandy had transformed the battlefield into a race of speed, supply, and momentum. Entire German formations were retreating, reforming, collapsing, or surrendering in fragments. Roads mattered more than speeches, and commanders who understood that difference survived long enough to influence the outcome. This is where the mistake begins. The German commander in this story was not irrational. He was not ignorant of the broader situation. He commanded a fortified position with fixed stone walls, natural elevation, and enough men to make any frontal assault costly from his perspective. Defiance was not suicide, it was leverage. A signal meant to force the Americans into delay, a statement designed to transform a simple military problem into a moral one. When he said, "You'll have to kill me," he believed he was complicating the situation. He believed he was raising the stakes. What he failed to understand was that he had already lost the only leverage that mattered. For commanders like George S. Patton, war was not a series of emotional exchanges. It was a system governed by choices and consequences. Patton did not view dramatic statements as bargaining tools. He viewed them as declarations of preference, and once a preference was declared, the problem stopped being ethical and became procedural. That is, the critical shift the story hinges on. Most people assume violence escalates. In reality, the most devastating actions often emerge from clarity when an opponent defines their own acceptable outcome, especially when that outcome excludes surrender. They remove uncertainty from the equation. They narrow the decision tree. They eliminate branches that might have led to delay, compromise, or restraint. Instead, it simplified their work. Before that sentence was spoken, multiple outcomes were still possible. The fortress could be bypassed, it could be masked by a smaller force, it could be isolated and starved, negotiations could be extended, prison, risked. As long as those options existed, decision-making required balance. After that sentence, balance disappeared. Once the commander framed death as the only acceptable resolution, the problem no longer involved persuasion. It involved execution. Not execution in the theatrical sense, but in the operational sense. Tax replaced debate. This is the paradox at the center of the story. Defiance did not delay destruction, it accelerated it. In modern thinking, we often assume that moral intensity creates hesitation, that a strong emotional stance forces the other side to slow down and reconsider. But that assumption depends entirely on facing an opponent. Against someone whose priority is speed and certainty, emotional language does not intimidate. It clarifies. Patton's reputation plays a role here, but not in the way popular culture suggests. He was not reckless for the sake of aggression. He was ruthless about inefficiency. He believed prolonged fighting wasted lives on both sides. It was negligent. The longer a position remained contested, the more people died for reasons that no longer mattered. From that perspective, a dramatic refusal to surrender was not honorable, it was wasteful, and waste demanded correction. This framing is uncomfortable because it strips heroism from language. It suggests that words spoken in the name of honor can become liabilities rather than shields. That belief collides directly with the way we like to remember war. We prefer stories where bravery alters outcomes, where courage bends history, where one man's refusal forces the machine to stop. But machines only stop when their inputs change. The German commander did not change the inputs. He clarified them. By defining death as his condition for surrender, he told the Americans exactly what outcome he would accept. And once that information was known, the remaining question was no longer whether the fortress would fall, but how efficiently it would be reduced. This is why the story matters beyond its immediate details. It is not about Patton's personality. It is not about the size of the guns or the thickness of the walls. It is about the moment when language ceases to be symbolic and becomes binding. The moment when a sentence transforms from rhetoric into instruction. That moment occurred before the first shell was fired. By the time the guns were positioned and the schedules drawn, the outcome had already been set in motion. The fortress was no longer a stronghold. It was a task, and tasks once defined do not respond to emotion. They respond to execution. What follows in this story is not a tragedy caused by chaos or misunderstanding. It is the logical end of a belief that defiance always creates leverage. In this case, it did the opposite. It removed the last remaining barrier between intent and action, and that is the frame through which everything that follows must be understood. Once the German commander's message reached American headquarters, the situation stopped evolving emotionally. It began evolving mechanically. This is the moment most war stories skip or rush through, the pause between words and violence, the quiet interval where decisions harden into plans in popular imagination. In reality, escalation often begins with calm agreement. Everyone understands the terms, everyone knows what comes next, and because of that clarity, nothing remains to be discussed. The message was short. It did not require interpretation. It did not signal desperation or confusion. It declared finality. And finality is a dangerous thing to offer an opponent whose doctrine dramatizes speed. For commanders like George S. Patton, uncertainty was the real enemy. Uncertainty slowed movement, consumed fuel, stretched supply lines, and forced men to die for positions that no longer mattered strategically. It was about clearing obstacles that interfered with momentum. The fortress was one such. Obstra represented a choice. It could be isolated, bypassed, or negotiated with. Each option had advantages and costs. Isolation saved lives but consumed time. Bypass preserved momentum but left a threat in the rear. None of these options were ideal, but all were possible after the message. Possibility collapsed when a defender declares that surrender is impossible. Negotiation ceases to exist. The only remaining variables are duration and intensity. How long will resistance last? How much force is required to end it? And how can that force be applied in a way that minimizes friendly casualties while maximizing certainty? At that point, escalation is not emotional. It is administrative. Orders begin to stack. Units are reassigned. Timoleons are drawn. Air assets are allocated windows. Engineers are briefed on breach points. Communication units are tasked with psychological operations. None of this requires anger. It requires alignment. This is where many commanders in history hesitated, not because they lacked capability, but because they feared the moral weight of discussion meant casualties. Casualties created scrutiny, and scrutiny created questions that lingered long after the fighting stopped. Some leaders preferred ambiguity. They preferred drawn-out engagements that allowed them to claim restraint, even if that restraint cost more lives in the end. Patton did not operate that way. To him, restraint was not measured by how little force was used, but by how quickly a situation was resolved. A prolonged fight was not merciful, it was wasteful. Every additional hour of resistance meant more soldiers exposed to risk, more civilians endangered by stray fire, and more opportunities for chaos. Escalation, in this framework, was a form of control. The German commander believed that by personalizing the conflict, he would introduce hesitation, that Patton would be forced to weigh optics, reputation, and legacy. Instead, personalization had the opposite effect, by tying the outcome to his own deteriorations from the equation. The conflict stopped being about territory or honor. and became about fulfilling a clearly stated condition. Once that condition was accepted, the remaining question was how to meet it efficiently. This is where the story shifts from belief to inevitability. Escalation did not begin with the first shell of no purpose. The fortress could not be ignored. It controlled a critical junction. Leaving it intact meant risking supply convoys, rerouting traffic, and exposing rear elements to attack in a fast-moving advance. That was unacceptable. By choosing Defiance, the commander transformed his position from a potential bargaining chip into a fixed problem that had to be eliminated. The response was not chaotic. It was layered. First came containment, not partial, not symbolic. Total isolation, roads sealed, approaches blocked. The goal was not immediate destruction, but certainty. No reinforcement, no resupply, no escape. Psychologically, it forces defenders to confront reality. Once isolation is complete, hope begins to fracture. Defenders stop imagining relief and start imagining outcomes. Second came preparation. Not hurried fire, but deliberate positioning. They identified sections where repeated fire could collapse, stone where underground chambers might fail under sustained pressure, where defensive advantages could be systematically stripped away. This kind of preparation is not born from rage. It is born from patience and confidence. Third came signaling. One of the most misunderstood aspects of escalation is communication. Many assume that overwhelming force should arrive without warning, that surprise maximizes shock, but surprise only matters when the defender still believes resistance might succeed. In this case, resistance had already been framed as terminal, so the escalation included communication, not as negotiation, but as confirmation. Loudspeakers were not brought forward to threaten. They were brought forward to inform. Schedules were announced. Faces were described. The defenders were told what would happen and when it would happen. Time itself became a weapon. By announcing the sequence, the attackers removed uncertainty, and uncertainty is often the last refuge of hope for the soldiers inside the fortress. This was the turning point, not the artillery, not the bombs, the realization that events were no longer reactive. They were pre-planned. The war outside had moved on, and they were about to be processed by it. Escalation works best when it feels inevitable. As hours passed, the gap between the commander's defiance and the reality faced by his troops widened. Individual soldiers began to reassess what loyalty meant. They were choosing between survival and obedience, and the more predictable the escalating became, the harder that choice became to ignore. This is the hidden cost of dramatic leadership. By framing resistance as absolute, the commander denied his subordinates flexibility. He left them no honorable exit. The very language meant to inspire unity instead fractured it. From the outside, Gesgelu continued calmly. Resources were allocated. Timeline, refined. Redundancies built in. The goal was not spectacle. It was finality. This is why escalating in this story matters more than the battle itself. The battle is simply the execution of a process that began with a sentence. Everything that followed was shaped by that initial framing. Once death was defined as the only acceptable outcome, every action taken afterward was aligned toward delivering it as quickly and decisively as possible. Escalation here is not a failure of diplomacy. It is the logical conclusion of clarity. The German commander believed defiance would complicate the situation. Instead, it simplified it beyond recovery. He believed it would buy time. Instead, it compressed time into a countdown. Instead, it forced them into a choice they never wanted to make. By the end of this phase, the fortress was no longer defended by confidence or belief. It was defended by inertia, and inertia is a weak foundation when facing an opponent who has already accepted the outcome. What followed would not be dramatic in the way stories often promise. It would be methodical, predictable, and devastating precisely because it had ceased to be personal. The words had already done their damage. The force that followed was simply the echo. When the first shells landed, nothing changed strategically. That may sound strange, but by the time the bombardment began, the battle had already been decided. What unfolded next was not a contest of wills or a test of bravery. It was the physical execution of a plan that had been finalized hours earlier. Momentum had already existed. The violence merely followed it. The opening phase was not chaotic. There was no frantic exchange of fire, no attempt to overwhelm through shock alone. The fire was deliberate, repetitive, focused. The same sections of wall were struck again and again, not to demonstrate power, but to produce failure. It cracks according to physics, not emotion. This distinction matters. Most people imagine destruction as an explosion of rage. In reality, the most effective destruction is quiet, disciplined, and boring. Repetition replaces spectacle. Precision replaces fury. Instead, the pressure was applied where collapse was mathematically inevitable. Inside the fortress, the effect was immediate but uneven. Some soldiers responded as they had been trained. They manned positions, returned fire, waited for orders. Others froze. Others began calculating. Each announcement shortened the psychological distance between anticipation and impact. When people know exactly when something will happen, fear does not spike. It compresses. Hours earlier, the commander's Defiance had framed resistance as noble. Now that framing was colliding with reality. Goals were failing. Orders became harder to transmit, harder to enforce. Loyalty began to erode under pressure, not because the men were weak, but because the situation had been stripped of ambiguity. Ambiguity is what allows people to hope the bombardment was not designed to annihilate. Eberraid Ibborn inside. Defensive concentrations were broken apart. The goal was not maximum casualties. This is an important difference that often gets lost in simplified war narratives. Killing is a consequence, not an objective. The objective is collapse. Once collapse occurs, killing decreases. Resistance becomes scattered. Units fragment. Individuals begin acting independently rather than as part of a coordinated defense. As this process unfolded, surrender began to appear not as cowardice, but as logic. Small groups emerged from damaged sections of the fortress, not in dramatic waves, quietly, hesitantly, hands raised. They were men recognizing that the defense no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Inside, the commander responded as rigid leaders often do when systems fail. He attempted to enforce loyalty through punishment. Soldiers who attempted to surrender were treated as traitors. When command structures are shattered, punishment accelerates collapse. Every execution confirmed what many already feared, that survival was no longer a priority of leadership, that obedience mattered more than lives, that the situation had crossed a line beyond which personal judgment was no longer valued. From the outside, this shift was visible. Fire returned sporadically, then inconsistently. Defensive responses became delayed. Gaps appeared in coverage positions that should have been reinforced. Remained silent. The pattern was unmistakable to experienced observers. The defense had not been broken by force alone. The ground assault that followed did not resemble the chaotic sieges people expect. There was no desperate last stand along every corridor. There was no heroic collapse of defenders fighting room to room. Instead, there was movement through space that had already been cycle-launched to point-blank range, where resistance remained. Engineers neutralized remaining strongpoint. Infantry cleared sections methodically, not rushing, not hesitating. Each action was the continuation of a process that had begun long before boots crossed the walls. This is why casualties during the assault were limited. When resistance collapses mentally, before it collapses physically, violence decreases. Defenders who still resisted did so briefly, often without coordination, before surrendering or being neutralized. The absence of a coherent command meant there was no mechanism left to sustain a fight. The commander was found where rigid leaders are often found at the end of such processes. Isolated. Removed from the reality his men had already accepted. When the final confrontation occurred, it was not cinematic. There was no speech, no symbolic gesture. A threat was identified and eliminated. The moment passed quickly. With it passed the last justification for resistance. The remaining soldiers' surrendement. Almost. Now Veden. The fortress, once believed capable of holding for weeks, had delayed the advance by hours. The cost was measured not in strategic gain but in unnecessary loss. Hundreds were dead or wounded, thousands were taken prisoner. The road junction was secured. The advance continued from a purely operation standpoint. From a human standpoint, it was the inevitable outcome of a belief that words could substitute for options. What is striking about this phase is how little emotion it required. There was no celebration afterward, no triumphal display. The work was completed, and attention shifted forward. This was not indifference. The objective had been removal of an obstacle, not revenge. Once the obstacle was gone, the system moved on. This is uncomfortable to confront because it suggests that morality in war is not expressed through restraint alone, but through decisiveness. That prolonging violence in the name of appearing humane can produce more suffering than ending it. The commander believed his defiance would matter, that it would force reconsideration, that it would slow the process. Instead, it accelerated it by stripping away uncertainty. By the time the shells fell, there was nothing left to argue about. The execution phase of clarity. And clarity, once achieved, does not reverse itself. What followed was not reflection or regret, but continuation. Supply lines reopened, movement resumed, another obstacle removed, another story added to the growing reputation. That refusal was not a negotiation, but a trigger. The fortress had not fallen because it was weak. It fell because it had defined its own ending. And once that ending was accepted, everything else became routine. The fighting ended quickly, but the consequences did not. In the immediate aftermath, the fortress was simply another cleared position. Engineers inspected the damage. Medical teams treated the wounded. Prisoners were processed from the perspective of the advance. The episode closed cleanly. There was no operational reason to dwell on it. But wars are not shaped only by what happens on the ground. They are shaped by what people believe about what happens on the ground, and this is where the fortress mattered far more than its walls ever did. Stories travel faster than orders. Soldiers talk. Officers compare mints and assemble patterns. Within days, the account of the fortress began circulating through German units, retreating ahead of the American advance, not as propaganda, not as exaggeration. As a cautionary example, the story was not that the Americans were unusually brutal. That narrative would have been familiar, even expected. That dramatic defiance had not forced negotiation, that it had produced a response so organized, so predictable, and so overwhelming that the position had effectively ceased to exist within half a day. This distinction mattered. German commanders had been trained to believe that fortifications bought time, that strong positions could delay even superior forces long enough to change the strategic picture. That resolve, when displayed clearly, could alter enemy behavior in earlier phases of the war. That belief had sometimes been justified by late 1944. It no longer was. The fortress demonstrated something new and deeply unsettling. It showed that certain American formations did not interpret defiance as a challenge to be tested, but as a condition to be fulfilled. When surrender was rejected absolutely, the risk lane driven by anger. It was procedure. This predictability was more frightening than randomness. Random violence can be endured because it offers hope. It suggests that outcomes depend on chance, timing, or individual decisions. Predictable violence offers no such comfort. It implies that once a line is crossed, the sequence that follows is fixed. German intelligence officers began noting this pattern. Units facing elements associated with George S. Patton reported a consistent experience. If accepted, treatment was professional. If refused, the response was swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. There was no middle ground. This forced German commanders into an uncomfortable calculation. The traditional concept of holding out for honor no longer produced strategic benefit, delaying actions that once tied down enemy resources now resulted in rapid annihilation. In that context, the fortress became a reference point. Officers did not discuss it as a heroic last stand. They discussed it as a mistake, a case study in what not to say when confronted with an opponent who had already moved past negotiation as a central strategy. This shift had measurable effects. Interrogations conducted later revealed that some German officers chose to surrender earlier than doctrine might have suggested, specifically because they had heard about the fortress. Not because they feared death, but because they understood the futility of defiance. Under those conditions, they recognized that resistance no longer served a purpose beyond symbolism. This is the quiet power of consequence. The fortress did not change the war by altering maps. It changed behavior by altering expectations. It taught both sides something important. For the Americans, it reinforced the effectiveness of clarity. For the Germans, it exposed the danger of mistaking language for leverage. The commander's death, which might have been framed as martyrdom, failed to achieve anything resembling meaning. It did not delay the advance. It did not inspire a counterattack. It did not rally surrounding units. It simply removed him from the equation. This is where the romantic narrative of Defiance collapses. Heroic language assumes an audience that can be influenced. It assumes an opponent who is still persuadable. In this case, the audience that mattered was operational, not emotional, and the opponent had already accepted the outcome the commander claimed to desire. The fortress also left a mark on American forces. Among Patton's troops, the episode reinforced a specific understanding of responsibility. They had offered surrender. They had communicated clearly. What followed was not viewed as cruelty, but as consequence. This framing mattered because it allowed soldiers to reconcile overwhelming force. They were not punishing resistance. They were executing an outcome that had been chosen by the defender. This belief does not eliminate moral tension, but it contains it. It creates a boundary between combat and vengeance. Once resistance ended, treatment changed immediately. Prisoners were fed, wounded were treated. This contrast became part of the broader reputation. The message was not, Americans are merciless. It was, Americans are literal. They take statements at face value. They act accordingly, and they do so without hesitation. When outcomes become predictable, fear transforms into calculation. Calculation leads to earlier surrender. Earlier surrender shortens fights, shorter fights. Reduce casualties on both sides. This is the logic that underpinned Patton's approach, and the fortress made it visible. Looking back, it is tempting to judge the German commander harshly, to label him fanatical, but doing so misses the broader point. His belief system was not unusual, it was outdated. He operated on assumptions that no longer matched the environment he was in. That mismatch is what killed his men. The aftermath forces a difficult question. At what point does adherence to honor become negligence? When does loyalty to an idea outweigh responsibility to the people expected to carry it out? The fortress does not answer these questions directly, but it exposes the cost of getting them wrong. In the days that followed, the advance continued, other positions fell. The war did not pause to reflect on the lesson. It absorbed it and moved forward. The fortress became a footnote in operational reports, but a warning in memory, not because of how fiercely it was defended, but because of how decisively it was erased. The real aftermath was not rubble. It was understanding. Understanding that in a war defined by momentum, words can be more dangerous than weapons, that declaring absolutes removes flexibility, and that when an opponent values efficiency over symbolism, defiance does not create leverage. It creates permission. What remained was not triumph, but clarity. Long after the rubble was cleared and the prisoners were moved, the fortress lingered as a question rather than a battle. Not a tactical question. That part was settled quickly. The position had fallen, the road junction had been secured, the advance had continued. From a military ledger, the outcome was unambiguous, was moral. Who exactly was responsible for what happened? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. The German commander chose defiance. He rejected surrender. He declared death as his condition. The consequences followed directly from that choice. End of story. But war is rarely satisfied with simple answers. Responsibility in war does not exist only at the moment of decision. It spreads, it binds leaders to outcomes they may never personally experience, and that is where the discomfort of this story lies. The commander believed he was acting honorably. Within his framework, surrender was disgrace, resistance was duty. Death was preferable to submission. They were absorbed over years of training, doctrine, and cultural reinforcement. He did not see himself as sacrificing his men, he saw himself as leading them. That distinction matters because it exposes the gap between intention and outcome. Intentions do not shield people from consequences. In fact, in environments where force is decisive, intentions can become irrelevant. Systems respond to inputs, not motives. The commander's words were processed not as an expression of character, but as a constraint, and once that constraint was accepted, the system behaved accordingly. This is the trap of absolute language. When someone declares, "never," they are removing their own ability to adapt when conditions change, and when the environment shifts faster than belief systems can adjust, absolutes become fatal. The fortress illustrates this with brutal clarity. The commander did not fail because he underestimated a power of symbolism. He believed that resolve could substitute for leverage, that a dramatic stance could slow an opponent whose incentives no longer aligned with persuasion. By the time his words reached the other side, persuasion was already obsolete. This reframes the role of George S. Patton in the story. Patton is often portrayed as a figure of aggression. But in this case, his defining trait was not anger, it was literalism. He took the commander at his word. He did not reinterpret the statement as theater or bravado. He did not search for hidden meanings. He accepted it as a declaration of preferred outcome, and that acceptance carried responsibility of its own. Could Patton have tried harder to persuade the commander? Possibly. Could he have delayed longer? Certainly. Could he have reduced the intensity of the response? Perhaps. But each of those choices would have required ignoring the clarity that had just been offered. This is where the moral tension sharpens. Is it more responsible to respect a stated choice, even when that choice leads to death? Or is it more responsible to override that choice in the name of preserving life? There is no universal answer. Different commanders, different cultures, and different moments in history would resolve that question differently. He believed that prolonging a fight in order to feel merciful often resulted in more suffering, not less. That dragging out violence to avoid appearing ruthless created conditions where more people died over time. In his framework, decisiveness was not cruelty, it was containment. That belief is deeply unsettling, and delay in war is often lethal. The fortress forces us to confront this paradox. The commander's refusal to surrender was framed as moral strength. The response to that refusal was framed as brutality. Yet the outcome reveals a different alignment. Hundreds died not because surrender was rejected by the Americans. The difference between survival and death was not fiery, it was language. This shifts responsibility back to leadership. Leaders do not only choose actions, they choose the boundaries within which actions become possible. By declaring death as the only acceptable outcome, the commander narrowed those boundaries to a single point. He gave them an endpoint. Once that endpoint was defined, the machinery of war moved toward it without hesitation. The lesson here is not that defiance is always wrong. There are moments when resistance changes history. There are times when refusal buys space, time, or leverage. But those moments depend on context. They depend on facing an opponent who still values negotiation. By September 1944, against fast-moving American forces, that context no longer existed. The tragedy of the fortress is not that the commander was wrong about honor, it is that he was right too late. He applied a framework from an earlier phase of the war to an environment that had evolved beyond it. And his men paid the price for that misalignment. Responsibility, then, does not lie solely with the man who pulled the trigger or the man who gave the order. It lies with the belief that words can freeze momentum once momentum has already become doctrine. This is why the story resonates beyond its time. Modern audiences are uncomfortable with it because it exposes how easily strong language can backfire, how quickly declarations meant to inspire can become binding commitments, and how systems designed for efficiency will exploit clarity without malice. The fortress did not fall because Patton and one's choice disappeared. Responsibility followed it into silence. The fortress is gone. The commander is dead. The road is open. On paper, the story ends cleanly. But stories like this rarely end where the fighting stops. What lingers is not the destruction but the unease, the uncomfortable realization that everything unfolded exactly as declared, that there was no misunderstanding, no tragic accident, no moment where things spiraled out of control. The sequence was clear, the terms were stated, the outcome followed. That clarity is what makes the story difficult to sit with. We are conditioned to believe that war is chaos, that violence erupts when communication fails, that tragedy emerges from confusion, hatred, or loss of control. The fortress challenges that belief. Here, communication did not fail. It succeeded perfectly. Everyone understood each other, and because of that, there was no room left for retreat. The German commander said, "You will have to kill me." This raises a question that cannot be dismissed easily. Was the outcome inevitable the moment those words were spoken? Or did responsibility still exist in the space between language and action? If Patton had ignored the statement, would that have been mercy or negligence? If he had delayed, would fewer men have died, or would more have died later in a longer, messier fight? There is no way to rerun the scenario. History does not offer control groups. What it offers instead is a pattern. Again and again, wars reveal that language does not merely describe reality. It shapes it in high-stakes environments. Words function as constraints. Once those boundaries are drawn, systems move to enforce them. This is why dramatic defiance is such a dangerous tool. It feels powerful because it is absolute. It sounds courageous because it rejects compromise, but absolutes do not intimidate systems built on efficiency. And once reduced, those outcomes are executed without sentiment. The paradox is cruel. The more final the language, the less control the speaker retains. The German commander believed his words would force hesitation. Instead, they removed it. He believed he was asserting agency. Instead, he surrendered it. Not to Patton personally, but to the logic of a system that no longer needed persuasion. This is what separates this story from simple morality tales. Patton is neither hero nor villain here. He is an operator within a framework that values momentum over symbolism. He did not invent the logic that destroyed the fortress. The destruction was not emotional, it was procedural. That makes it harder to condemn and harder to excuse. Once resistance ended, violence stopped, prisoners were treated, wounded were cared for. There was no lingering cruelty. The switch flipped off as cleanly as it had flipped on. This consistency reinforces the disturbing truth at the heart of the story. The system did not want suffering, it wanted resolution. The fortress delayed the advance by hours. It cost hundreds of lives. It achieved nothing that surrender would not have avoided. Yet from the commander's perspective, surrender was unthinkable. Not because it was ineffective, but because it violated belief. This is where the story extends beyond war. In any environment governed by systems rather than sentiment, dramatic language carries risk, ultimatums, feel strong but they narrow future options. They commit the speaker to outcomes they may not fully control. When faced with an opponent who takes words literally, those declarations become instructions. The fortress teaches this lesson without metaphor. No one misheard, no one misunderstood, no one escalated out of anger. A sentence was spoken, a sequence followed. People died. That is the paradox that remains. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can say is exactly what you mean. And sometimes the person listening is willing to take you at your word. The German commander believed defiance was strength. Patton believed clarity was enough. Between those two beliefs, an outcome formed that neither side could undo once it began. The fortress fell not because it was weak, but because language removed every alternative to force. The story does not ask us to admire that outcome. It asks us to recognize it. Because in environments where systems move faster than reflection, words do not slow violence down. They accelerate it, and once spoken, they cannot be taken back. Do you think Patton should have tried harder to save the German commander's life, or was the outcome the commander's responsibility? The moment he spoke those words, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more true World War II stories about leadership, choices, and consequences.